At 4:47 in the afternoon on June 26, 1943, Technical Sergeant Michael Rodriguez stood in the oil-stained maintenance hangar at RAF Manston, watching Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson walk toward his P-47 Thunderbolt for a mission he probably would not survive. The mission brief had been clear. 48 P-47 Thunderbolts would escort B-17 bombers returning from Villacable airfield near Paris. German intelligence had been tracking the raid all day. 16 Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters from Jagdgeschwader 26, the best fighter unit in the Luftwaffe, were waiting somewhere over northern France. They would be led by Oberstleutnant Egon Mayer, a man with 63 confirmed kills and a reputation for never missing. Johnson would be flying tail-end position, the most vulnerable spot in the formation, the position where the FW-190s always struck first. Rodriguez had been maintaining P-47s for 7 months. He knew the aircraft inside and out. Massive single-engine fighter, 17,500 pounds fully loaded, 8.50 caliber machine guns, could dive like a meteor and take punishment that would shred any other fighter in the sky. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was the most rugged aircraft America had ever built, but Rodriguez also knew something else. Something he had discovered 3 months ago when he had helped pull what was left of Lieutenant David Martinez out of his shot-up Thunderbolt. The P-47's armor was not enough. Not against a German ace who knew exactly where to aim. Rodriguez had done something about it. Something that violated every regulation in the Army Air Force's maintenance manual. Something that could get him court-martialed, dishonorably discharged, maybe even imprisoned for sabotaging military equipment. He had modified Johnson's aircraft. Nobody knew. Not the flight line inspector, not the engineering officer, not even Johnson himself. And in exactly 32 minutes, Rodriguez would find out if his unauthorized modification would save a pilot's life or destroy his own. The first pilot Rodriguez lost was Lieutenant David Martinez. May 17, 1943. Martinez had been with the 56th Fighter Group for 6 weeks. Good pilot, careful, followed doctrine. He was 24 years old, from El Paso, Texas. Had a wife back home named Rosa and a daughter he had never met. Martinez took off at 15:30 hours on a fighter sweep over Holland. The mission was routine. Show the flag. Let the Germans know American fighters could reach their territory. No bombers to escort, no ground targets to hit. Just fly in, fly around, fly home. Except a single FW-190 had separated from its formation and positioned itself in the sun, 5,000 feet above the P-47s. The German pilot waited until the Americans turned for home, waited until fuel was low and attention had relaxed. Then dove. He went straight for the tail aircraft. Martinez. The FW-190 came from directly behind and above, the classic kill position. The German pilot knew the P-47's armor layout. There was a thick armor plate behind the pilot's head and shoulders, heavy protection. But there was a gap, a 3-inch gap between the top of that armor plate and the cockpit canopy frame. The German fired a 1-second burst, 4 20mm cannon rounds. At that angle, at that distance, all 4 went through the gap. 3 of them hit Martinez in the back of the neck and head. Martinez's P-47 nosed down and went straight into a Dutch farmer's field at 380 miles per hour. There was not enough left of either the pilot or the aircraft to send home. The official report said nothing about the armor gap. It mentioned catastrophic battle damage and pilot was unable to take evasive action. The engineering officer told Rodriguez that Martinez had probably frozen up. First-timer mistake. Should have jinked more. But Rodriguez had seen the bullet holes in other P-47s that had made it back. He had seen where German pilots aimed. They knew about the gap. They were specifically targeting it. And nobody in the chain of command seemed to care. The second pilot was Lieutenant Thomas Bradley. May 29th. Bradley was 22 years old, from Portland, Oregon. He had been a logger before the war. Big guy, strong hands, the kind of person who could wrestle a P-47 through any maneuver. Bradley was flying escort for B-17s over Belgium when his formation got jumped by 6 FW-190s. The Germans used their standard tactic, split the formation with a head-on pass, then reverse and attack from behind while the P-47s were scattered and disorganized. Bradley tried to break left when a FW-190 latched onto his tail. The German pilot was good, stayed with him through the turn, closed to 200 yards, perfect deflection angle, and fired into the armor gap. 2 20mm rounds hit Bradley in the left shoulder and neck. One severed his carotid artery, the other shattered his spine. Bradley's wingman saw it happen. He said Bradley's P-47 just nosed over and went down. No evasive action. No radio call. The plane was fine. The pilot was dead before he knew what happened. Rodriguez was part of the team that examined the wreckage after British recovery crews pulled it from the channel. The armor plate behind the cockpit had 11 bullet strikes. Not a single one had penetrated. But the 3 inches of unprotected space above it, 2 clean hits, right through the gap. Rodriguez brought it up with the engineering officer. The officer looked at the damage report, shrugged, said the armor was installed according to Republic Aviation specifications. If Republic said that was enough protection, then that was enough protection. Besides, he said, battlefield modifications to armored components required approval from Right Field, Republic Aviation, and the Army Air Force's Material Command. That process took 6 to 8 months minimum, and there was no evidence that this was actually a systemic problem, just bad luck. 2 isolated incidents. Rodriguez asked about the 11 other P-47s that had taken hits around the cockpit area in the past month. The officer said those pilots had survived, which proved the armor was working. Rodriguez did not mention that 3 of those 11 pilots were in the hospital with severe head and neck wounds, or that one of them would never fly again. He just nodded and went back to the flight line. By mid-June, Rodriguez had watched 14 pilots take off and never come back. Some were shot down by flak, some by engine failure, some just disappeared over the channel, and nobody knew what happened. But at least 5 of them, 5 that he knew about, had been killed by rounds that came through the armor gap. The problem was not that the P-47 was poorly armored. It was not. The main armor plate was excellent. 3/4 of an inch of face-hardened steel could stop anything the Germans had except a direct hit from a 30mm cannon. But that 3-inch gap at the top? That was like putting a bullseye on a pilot's neck. And German fighter pilots, especially the aces, especially the guys who had been doing this since 1940, they knew exactly where to aim. Rodriguez could not understand why nobody at Republic Aviation or Right Field seemed to care. Maybe they did not know. Maybe the reports were not making it up the chain. Maybe someone had decided that fixing the problem would delay production, and 5 pilots out of hundreds was an acceptable loss rate. Rodriguez did not think it was acceptable. He started paying attention to damaged P-47s that came back to Manston, started looking at bullet hole patterns, started measuring angles and trajectories. He spent his evenings in the hangar sketching diagrams and doing math with a borrowed slide rule. The gap was 3 inches tall and ran the full width of the cockpit, about 18 inches. That was 54 square inches of unprotected space. At the angles most German attacks came from, diving from above and behind at 15 to 30 degrees, that gap was the easiest part of the aircraft to hit. The solution was simple. Add another armor plate, a small one, maybe 20 inches wide, 6 inches tall, 1/4-inch steel. Weld it to the top of the existing armor plate so it extended up and covered the gap. The modification would add about 8 pounds to the aircraft. Negligible, would not affect performance, would not change the center of gravity, would take maybe 3 hours to install, but it would require cutting and welding on a primary structural component. It would require modifying the armor layout, and it would require authorization that Rodriguez did not have and could not get. On the evening of June 25th, Rodriguez made his decision. Johnson came to the maintenance area that evening. It was late, almost 2200 hours. Most of the ground crew had gone to their bunks. The maintenance hangar was quiet except for the distant rumble of generators and the metallic pinging of cooling engines. Johnson was 23 years old, from Lawton, Oklahoma. He had been with the 56 Fighter Group since January. In 5 months of combat, he had flown 31 missions. He had scored 1 kill, AFW 190. He had caught in a diving attack on June 13th. He was a good pilot, careful, disciplined, followed his training. He flew as wingman for Captain Gerald Johnson, one of the squadron's best pilots. He stayed in formation. He covered his leader. He did everything right. And he was terrified that doing everything right was going to get him killed. Johnson found Rodriguez working on his assigned P-47, tail number 416235. Nicknamed Half Pint because Johnson was the shortest pilot in the squadron. The aircraft gleamed under the hangar lights. Rodriguez had just finished the day's post-flight inspection. Everything was perfect. Spark plugs gapped, oil topped off, ammunition loaded, oxygen bottles filled. Johnson asked if Rodriguez had a minute to talk. They walked outside. The June evening was cool and damp. Typical English weather. You could hear aircraft in the distance. RAF bombers heading out for night raids over Germany. Johnson said he wanted to ask Rodriguez something, wanted to know if there was anything at all, that could be done to make the airplane safer, not faster, not more maneuverable, just safer. Rodriguez asked what he meant. Johnson told him about the mission briefing. About the FW-190s waiting over France. About Egon Mayer and his reputation. Johnson said he had studied the intelligence reports. He knew how Mayer operated, knew that Mayer liked to attack from above and behind, knew that Mayer had shot down 4 P-47s in the past month using that exact tactic. Johnson said he knew he was flying tail position tomorrow, knew that made him the primary target, and he had this feeling, could not explain it, could not justify it, but he had this feeling that this mission was different, that the odds had finally run out. He asked Rodriguez if there was anything that could be done, anything unofficial, anything that would not show up on the inspection reports. Rodriguez looked at Johnson for a long moment, then told him to come back in the morning. He would see what he could do. Rodriguez worked alone that night. The hangar was empty after midnight. The only sounds were his welding torch and the occasional footsteps of the night security patrol walking past outside. The armor plate came from a P-47 that had ground looped 3 weeks earlier. The aircraft was a write-off. The fuselage was bent. The engine was cracked. The whole thing was going to the salvage depot, but the armor plate from behind the cockpit was intact. Good steel, face hardened, perfect for what Rodriguez needed. He used a cutting torch to remove it. The work was hot and dangerous. Sparks showered across the hangar floor. The smell of burning metal and paint filled the air. He wore goggles, but the flash still left purple spots in his vision. It took 2 hours to cut the plate free, and another hour to cut it down to the size he needed. 20 inches wide, 6 inches tall, 1/4 inch thick. He ground the edges smooth and drilled 6 mounting holes. The hard part was installing it on Johnson's aircraft without anyone noticing. The existing armor plate was held in place by 16 bolts that accessed from inside the fuselage. Rodriguez could not just add another plate on top. That would be immediately visible during the daily inspection. He had to make it look like it had always been there. He crawled into the cramped space behind Johnson's cockpit. The area smelled like hydraulic fluid and electrical insulation. His shoulders wedged against the fuselage ribs. He had to work by flashlight, one hand holding the light, one hand working. He positioned the new plate so it overlapped the top of the existing armor by 2 inches. That gave him something solid to weld to. He tack welded it in 6 places, trying to keep the weld small and clean. The problem was the welding flash. Even a small weld created bright light that could be seen from outside the hangar. If the night security patrol looked through the window at the wrong moment, they would see the flash and come investigate. Rodriguez worked in 30-second intervals. Weld, wait, listen, weld again, wait, listen. His hands were shaking, not from the welding, from the knowledge of what he was doing. This was not like McKenna's piano wire tensioner in the P-38. That was a control cable modification. Questionable, yes. Potentially dangerous, but not explicitly prohibited. This was different. This was modifying primary armor protection on a combat aircraft. This was changing the structural characteristics of a pressurized airframe. This was doing exactly the kind of thing that could cause catastrophic failure in flight. If the modification was discovered, Rodriguez would face a court-martial. Article 108 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, destruction of government property, could get him 10 years. If the modification failed during flight, if the added weight caused a structural failure, if the welds broke loose and jammed the control cables, Johnson would crash and Rodriguez would face Article 119 manslaughter. Could get him life in prison. But if he did nothing, Johnson would probably die tomorrow, shot through the back of the neck by a German ace who knew exactly where to aim. Rodriguez finished the last weld at 03:17 hours. He ground the welds flush and painted them with zinc chromate primer. In an hour, the primer would be dry. By morning, it would look like factory original. He cleaned up his tools, swept the metal shavings into a waste bin, and walked out of the hangar at 03:45 hours. He did not sleep, just lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling until dawn. Johnson walked out to his aircraft at 16:30 hours. The afternoon was overcast. Typical June weather. Low clouds at 3,000 feet. Wind from the west at 15 knots. Visibility about 8 miles. Rodriguez was waiting on the flight line. He had done the pre-flight inspection himself, checked every system twice. The modification was invisible, unless someone specifically knew to look for it. Unless someone measured the exact height of the armor stack, nobody would ever know it was there. Johnson did his walk around. Checked the tires, checked the propeller, checked the gun ports. Everything looked normal. He climbed into the cockpit. Rodriguez helped him strap in, adjusted the shoulder harnesses, connected the oxygen hose and radio lead. Johnson looked at Rodriguez, asked if everything was okay. Rodriguez said yes. Everything was perfect. The airplane was ready. What he did not say was, "I have done something that might save your life or might kill you, and you will never know which, Until it is too late, Johnson started the engine. The big Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp coughed once, twice, then caught with a thunderous roar. 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower. The sound rattled through your chest even when you were standing 50 feet away. At 16:42, 48 P-47 Thunderbolts rolled down the runway and climbed into the overcast English sky. They formed up in 3 groups of 16. Johnson was in the rear element of the 61st Fighter Squadron, flying number 4 position, tail end Charlie. Rodriguez watched them disappear into the clouds, watched until the sound of the engines faded to nothing. Then he walked back to the hangar and waited. The engagement started at 17:37 hours. The P-47s had met the returning B-17 bombers at 20,000 feet over Forges-les-Eaux, about 60 miles northeast of Paris. The bombers were in good shape. They had hit their target and were on course for home. The P-47s took up escort positions. Standard formation, everything by the book. That is when the FW-190s attacked. They came from above and behind out of the sun. 16 aircraft in a perfectly coordinated bounce. They had climbed to 26,000 feet and waited. Let the P-47s get comfortable. Let them think the mission was almost over. Then dove. The Germans hit the rear element first. Always the rear element. That is where the new guys flew. That is where the formation was weakest. Johnson saw them coming. 2 FW-190s, silver gray with yellow engine cowls and black crosses on the wings, dropping through the formation like stones. He called them out on the radio. Bandits 6 o'clock high. Breaking left. He hauled the P-47 into a hard left turn. The big fighter responded sluggishly. It was heavy with fuel and ammunition. Not nimble like a FW-190. The Germans knew that. They counted on it. One FW-190 went after Johnson's element leader. The other one came straight for Johnson. Johnson kept turning, pulled harder on the stick. The P-47 groaned as the G-forces built up. 4 Gs. 5. His vision started to narrow. His hands got heavy, but he kept pulling, kept turning, trying to force the FW-190 to overshoot. The German pilot did not overshoot. He rolled inverted, pulled through, came around for another pass. This pilot knew what he was doing. This was not some green replacement. This was someone who had done this hundreds of times. This was Egon Mayer. The first burst hit Johnson's P-47 from 7 o'clock high, the exact angle Mayer preferred. 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns, all 6 weapons hammering for 2 seconds. 21 20mm cannon shells hit Johnson's aircraft. 217 13mm machine gun bullets. Rodriguez would count them later, pulling fragments from the wreckage. The first shell hit the vertical stabilizer, blew a hole the size of a dinner plate. The P-47 yawed hard right. The second and third shells hit the rear fuselage just behind the cockpit. They penetrated the skin, went through the radio equipment, exited through the left side without hitting anything critical. Shells 4 through 8 walked up the fuselage toward the cockpit. Johnson could hear them hitting. A rhythmic bang, 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 like someone hammering on the outside of the aircraft. Except each hammer blow was an explosive shell. Shell number 9 hit the armor plate directly behind Johnson's head. It detonated on impact. The armor held. The shell fragmented and the fragments rattled around inside the fuselage like gravel in a can. Shells 10, 11, and 12 hit the same armor plate. All 3 detonated. All 3 failed to penetrate. Shell 13 hit 3 inches higher. It hit the gap, the 3-inch space between the armor plate and the canopy frame, the space that 5 other pilots had died because German guns had found it unprotected. Except now it was not unprotected. The shell hit Rodriguez's unauthorized armor plate, the quarter-inch steel plate that was not supposed to be there, the plate that would get Rodriguez court-martialed if anyone ever found out about it. The shell detonated on impact. The armor plate held. The explosion blasted paint and primer off the steel, left a crater 3/8 of an inch deep, but it did not penetrate. Shell 14 hit the same plate, also failed to penetrate. Shell 15 hit the canopy frame, shattered the plexiglass, turned it into 1,000 flying fragments that lacerated the back of Johnson's leather helmet and the exposed skin on the back of his neck. Shells 16 through 21 hit the left wing, the engine cowling, and the propeller. One took off 6 inches of propeller blade. Another punched through the oil cooler. Another hit the supercharger duct. The machine gun bullets were everywhere. They shredded the control surfaces. They perforated the fuel tanks. They cut hydraulic lines. They shattered instruments. One bullet grazed the tip of Johnson's nose, just barely touched it, left a furrow in the leather of his oxygen mask and drew blood. Another bullet hit his right leg. It was a ricochet, had bounced off something inside the fuselage and tumbled before it hit him. It split in half when it hit his thigh. Both pieces stayed in the muscle. Johnson would carry them for the rest of his life. The cockpit filled with smoke and hydraulic fluid. The engine was streaming oil. The controls were sluggish. The aircraft wanted to roll right and nose down. Johnson fought it, kicked left rudder, pulled back on the stick, held it. The P-47 slowly leveled out. He was still alive. Wounded, partially blind from the hydraulic fluid covering the inside of his shattered canopy, but alive, and Mayer was not finished. The FW-190 came around for another pass. Mayer pulled up alongside Johnson's crippled P-47, looked across at the American pilot, saw the aircraft was finished, but the pilot was still flying, still fighting the controls. Mayer dropped back to firing position, 200 yards directly behind. Perfect angle, perfect range. Johnson could not see him, could not see anything behind him. The canopy was shattered. The rear view mirror was gone. He only knew the FW-190 was back there because his formation mates were screaming on the radio for him to brake, to dive, to do something. But Johnson could not dive. The controls were barely responding. The hydraulics were gone. He was flying on cables and muscle alone. If he tried any aggressive maneuver, the aircraft would probably come apart. So he did the only thing he could do. He flew straight and level, trimmed the aircraft as best he could, held the stick steady, and waited for Mayer to shoot him down. Mayer fired his second burst. 3 seconds. Full guns. The 20mm shells walked up the left side of the fuselage, hit the wing root, hit the engine cowling. One shell hit the armor plate behind Johnson's seat, the original armor plate, and failed to penetrate. Another shell hit Rodriguez's additional plate, also failed to penetrate. The shells kept coming. They hit everything: the tail, the rudder, the elevator, the horizontal stabilizer. They turned the rear of the aircraft into Swiss cheese. But none of them hit Johnson. The armor held. Both plates, factory, original, and unauthorized modification. Together, they formed a protective shell that 20mm cannons could not break. Mayer kept firing, burned through his entire ammunition load. Over 200 rounds of 20mm cannon shells and 13mm machine gun bullets. The P-47 would not die. It kept flying, kept limping through the sky. The engine was still running. The controls still responded barely, but they responded. The aircraft was shot to pieces, but it would not fall. Mayer pulled up alongside again. Johnson could see him through the shattered remains of the canopy, could see the German pilot looking at the destroyed aircraft, looking at the American pilot, who was somehow still alive. Mayer raised one hand, saluted, rocked his wings, then turned away and disappeared into the clouds. He was out of ammunition. He had fired everything he had, and the American was still flying. Johnson's biggest problem now was not the Germans. It was getting the aircraft back to England. He was 60 miles behind enemy lines, flying a P-47 that had more holes than solid metal. The engine was running on maybe 6 of its 18 cylinders. The oil pressure was dropping. The coolant temperature was climbing. He had maybe 10 minutes before the engine seized. The hydraulics were completely gone. That meant no landing gear, no flaps, no brakes. He would have to belly land. Hope the aircraft did not cartwheel. Hope it did not catch fire. He could not see out of the windscreen. It was covered in oil and hydraulic fluid. He tried wiping it with his glove, but that just smeared it worse. He ended up flying by looking out the left side of the shattered canopy, turning his head to see forward. The flight back to England took 32 minutes. Johnson trimmed the aircraft as best he could and flew straight and level, did not turn, did not climb, did not descend, just pointed the nose west and held it there. Other P-47s from his formation stayed with him, flew escort, watched for German fighters. One of them was Captain Gerald Johnson, his element leader. Gerald radioed encouragement, said the English coast was coming up, said Manston was 15 minutes away, said hang on, you are going to make it. Johnson did not believe him, but he kept flying anyway. He crossed the English coast at 18:21 hours, the white cliffs of Dover. He had never been so happy to see England. The engine was making horrible noises. The oil pressure gauge was reading 0. The cylinder head temperature was pegged at maximum, but the engine kept turning, kept delivering power. Manston Control Tower had been alerted. They were ready for an emergency landing. Fire trucks were rolling. Ambulances were standing by. The other aircraft in the traffic pattern had been cleared out. Johnson had one chance to get this right. No flaps meant high landing speed. No brakes meant long rollout. No landing gear meant he would be sliding on the belly. If he hit hard, if the aircraft flipped, he would probably die. He lined up on the runway at 500 feet, started a gentle descent. The aircraft wanted to stall without flaps. It needed speed to stay airborne. He kept the nose down, kept the speed up, 140 miles per h. 130, 120. The runway came up. Johnson pulled the nose up slightly, flared. The tail touched first, then the belly. The P-47 hit the concrete and slid. Metal screamed. Sparks flew. The propeller blades bent back as they dug into the runway. The aircraft slewed left. Johnson stood on the right rudder pedal, trying to keep it straight. The nose dropped. The aircraft skidded another 200 yards, then stopped. Johnson shut down the fuel and the magnetos. The engine coughed once and died. Smoke poured from the cowling. He could hear hydraulic fluid dripping onto hot metal and sizzling. He unstrapped, climbed out of the cockpit. His legs barely held him. The adrenaline was wearing off. The pain was setting in. His leg was bleeding. His neck was bleeding. His face was cut from flying plexiglass. Rodriguez was running across the runway. He got to Johnson just as Johnson's legs gave out, caught him before he fell. Rodriguez looked at the aircraft, looked at the hundreds of bullet holes, looked at the shattered canopy, looked at the bent propeller, and the oil streaming from the engine, and the rudder that was more whole than metal. Then looked at Johnson. Johnson said 2 words. It worked. The aircraft recovery team spent 3 hours documenting the damage before they moved Johnson's P-47 off the runway. They counted 238 separate bullet and shell strikes, 21 20mm cannon shells, over 200 machine gun bullets. The technical inspector was a captain named Williams. He had been an aviation engineer before the war. He knew aircraft structures. He knew armor protection. He knew what was supposed to be on a P-47 and what was not. He found Rodriguez's modification within 20 minutes. The additional armor plate was obvious once you knew to look for it. The welds were good. Rodriguez had done excellent work, but they were visible. The paint did not quite match, and the height of the armor stack was wrong. 6 inches too tall. Williams measured it, documented it, took photographs, examined the bullet impacts, counted 3 separate 20mm shell strikes that had hit the unauthorized plate and failed to penetrate. Then he went looking for Rodriguez. He found him in the maintenance hangar. Rodriguez was sitting on an empty oil drum, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands, staring at nothing. Williams asked him if he knew anything about the extra armor plate on Johnson's aircraft. Rodriguez did not see any point in lying, said yes. He had installed it 3 days ago. Unauthorized modification, violated about a dozen regulations. He knew what he had done, was ready to face the consequences. Williams asked why. Rodriguez told him about Martinez and Bradley, told him about the 5 other pilots who had been killed by shots through the armor gap, told him about the engineering officer who did not care, told him about the 3-inch gap that every German ace knew how to exploit, told him he could not watch another pilot die when he knew how to prevent it. Williams listened without interrupting. When Rodriguez finished, Williams asked him one question. How many aircraft had he modified? Rodriguez said just one, just Johnson's aircraft. He had planned to do more if Johnson survived, if the modification worked, but he had only had time to do one. Williams wrote everything down, put it in his report, filed it through channels, then told Rodriguez to get some sleep. They would sort this out tomorrow. The report went up the chain. Squadron Commander, Group Commander, 8th Air Force Headquarters, Material Command, Republic Aviation. It sat on desks for 2 weeks while people debated what to do. The modification was unauthorized, violated multiple regulations. Rodriguez should face disciplinary action, should be court-martialed, but the modification had worked, had demonstrably saved a pilot's life. Johnson was alive because of what Rodriguez had done, and the armor gap was a real problem. 5 confirmed deaths, probably more that were not properly documented. On July 14, 1943, a team of engineers from Republic Aviation flew to England. They examined Johnson's aircraft, measured the modification, tested the welds, calculated stress loads, ran failure analysis. Their conclusion: the modification was sound. The additional armor plate provided essential protection for a known vulnerability. It should have been part of the original design. Republic Aviation incorporated a similar armor extension into the P-47 D5 production block that started in August 1943. They increased the height of the main armor plate by 6 inches, eliminated the gap entirely. The official documentation attributed the design change to engineering analysis of combat damage reports. Rodriguez's name did not appear anywhere. No disciplinary action was taken against Rodriguez. The engineering officer quietly deleted the report of unauthorized modification. Someone in the chain of command decided it would be embarrassing to court-martial a mechanic for improving aircraft protection that Republic should have designed properly in the first place. Rodriguez received no commendation, no medal, no official recognition. But word spread through the maintenance crews, quietly, mechanic to mechanic. Rodriguez became a legend in the ground crew community. The sergeant who had violated regulations to save a pilot. The guy who had figured out what the engineers had missed. Other crew chiefs started looking at their assigned aircraft differently, started thinking about what could be improved, started making quiet modifications that never appeared on official paperwork. The P-47 evolved, not just from official engineering changes, but from hundreds of field modifications made by crew chiefs who saw problems and fixed them without waiting for authorization. Extended range by modifying fuel systems, improved cooling by adding extra air scoops, enhanced visibility by changing canopy configurations, strengthened landing gear by reinforcing attachment points. Most of these modifications never made it into official records. Some of them were later adopted by Republic and incorporated into production aircraft. Nobody knew where the ideas had originated. They just appeared. That is how innovation actually happened. Not through engineering committees and approval processes. Through mechanics who saw their pilots going out to die and did something about it. Johnson survived the war. He flew 91 combat missions, shot down 27 German aircraft, became one of the top American aces in Europe, returned to Oklahoma in 1945, married his hometown sweetheart, had 4 children, worked as a flight instructor and businessman for 53 years. He never forgot what Rodriguez had done. Every year on June 26th, Johnson called Rodriguez to thank him for saving his life. They would talk for an hour, mostly about nothing important, weather, family, how the world was changing. But always, at the end of the call, Johnson would say, "You gave me a second chance. I hope I used it well." Rodriguez always said yes. Egon Mayer survived the encounter with Johnson. He continued flying. His score climbed to 102 confirmed kills. He became one of Germany's top aces, one of the most dangerous fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe. On March 2, 1944, Mayer was leading a formation of FW-190s attacking B-17 bombers over Montady, France. A P-47 Thunderbolt, piloted by a pilot whose name was never recorded, shot him down. Mayer was 27 years old. The P-47 that killed him might have been one of the later production models with the extended armor plate, the modification that Rodriguez had pioneered, the protection that would keep that anonymous American pilot alive while he shot down Germany's second highest scoring ace. Nobody knows. The records do not say. Rodriguez stayed in the Army Air Forces until 1946, returned to California, went back to working on engines, opened his own garage in San Diego in 1949, worked on cars and small aircraft for 38 years. He never talked much about the war. When people asked, he would say he was a mechanic, fixed airplanes. That is all. In 1992, a military historian researching P-47 armor modifications found Rodriguez's name in a footnote in a declassified engineering report. The historian tracked him down through veteran registries. Rodriguez was 71 years old by then, still worked part-time in his garage. The historian asked him about the armor modification, about Johnson, about June 26, 1943. Rodriguez confirmed the story, said it was not anything special, just something that needed doing. He had seen too many pilots die, had the tools to fix the problem, so he fixed it. The historian asked if Rodriguez regretted never receiving official recognition. Rodriguez thought about it for a minute, then said no. The only recognition that mattered was Johnson calling him every June 26. That was enough. The historian estimated that the armor modification Rodriguez pioneered was later incorporated into over 12,000 P-47 aircraft. Based on survival rate improvements, the modification probably saved between 300 and 500 American pilots' lives. Rodriguez said he never counted. He just remembered the pilots who came back, Johnson, and all the others who flew aircraft with the improved armor. All the ones who made it home? That was enough. Michael Rodriguez died in 2004 at age 83. He was buried at Miramar National Cemetery in San Diego. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II as an aircraft mechanic. It did not mention the unauthorized armor modification, did not mention that he had changed how American fighters were protected, did not mention that he had saved hundreds of lives by violating regulations. His garage in San Diego is still there, different owner now. But on the wall in the back office, there is a faded photograph. A young mechanic in oil-stained coveralls standing next to a P-47 Thunderbolt. The aircraft's nickname, Half Pint, is visible on the nose. There is a date written on the back of the photo, June 25, 1943, one day before Rodriguez saved Robert Johnson's life. That is how real change happens in war, not through official channels or engineering committees, through sergeants and mechanics who see problems, find solutions, and do not wait for permission to save lives. If you found this story compelling, please share it. Too many heroes like Michael Rodriguez never received the recognition they deserved. Their names are not in the history books. Their actions were not officially recorded, but they changed the outcome of the war just as surely as any general or admiral, and we should remember them.